Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 210 of the Kiss Army Nation podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Pasquale Veri.
And I am Claudio Spera. Welcome to the show, everyone.
From ditching the makeup to chasing radio hits, from shifting lineups to shredding guitars, the 80s were a turbulent and transformative era for the band. But how did Kiss compare to the giants of the glam and metal scene, bands like Mötley Crüe, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, and Van Halen? So on this episode, it's all about dissecting the music, the image, the visibility, and the impact. Was Kiss keeping pace or losing ground? Were they trendsetters or followers?
So we've been talking a lot about 80s Kiss on the show lately. So what better panel guest than Patrick de Montigny and Michael Bournassian to discuss this awesome era? Welcome back to the show, boys.
Hello.
Always good to be here.
It's always good to see you guys. So how have it been? So how's the summer treating you these days? It's all good? Yeah.
So far so good. The weather's warming up. I saw ZZ Top last night, so all is good.
Nice. How about you, Pat? You're doing okay?
Same here, working on the house and everything, and it's all good. So far, so good. No complaints here either.
Ask me.
Pasky, well, how are you doing, buddy?
How are you doing, Pasquale?
Fantastic. Today is the first day of my vacation, my summer vacation. And what a way to start recording an episode of the Kiss Army Nation podcast.
I can feel the energy, man. You're all pumped up. Man.
Oh, I really am. I really am.
I love it. So, guys, let's start the show with a bit of a general question about 80s Kiss. So, do you think Kiss in makeup? This is a very good question, I have to say, Pask. This is an awesome way to start. So, do you think Kiss in makeup could have survived the 80s? Michael, started with you.
Okay, so as I've said a few times already, I knew about Kiss in the 80s. I didn't get full-blown into them until the 90s, but I certainly knew what they were about in the 80s. To answer the question with brevity, would they have survived the 80s?
With makeup.
No, I think they needed to make a change visually. Okay. Musically, I think they had already started going down the road that helped them survive the 80s, especially starting with Creatures of the Night and with the other albums that we're going to start speaking of shortly. But visually, I think, yes, they had to make a change, especially for the North American audience. I mean, it had reached a point where they could go anywhere else in the world and be, treated like kings, but not in their own home country or in North America. Canada and United States, the market had, or the desire to see Kiss and makeup had dried up to a certain degree. I mean, you saw that on the Creatures of the Night tour, despite how great that album is and despite how great the shows were, the people just were not turning out. So I think visually they needed to make a change, but musically they were already on the road to doing what they wanted to do and getting in the 80s music race. I think they were already on the path to doing that. But yes, visually they needed to make a change. So no, with the makeup as it was in the 70s, I don't think it would have worked out as well.
Okay, fair enough. Pat, what do you think?
For my part, I agree with Michael. I don't think it would have worked out because having been there, even before they dropped the makeup, like between 1980 and 1983, when they did get rid of the makeup, they were already considered past. And I think I might have brought this up before. It probably had to do with the fact that they had musically went into other grounds, which sort of like drove away the hardcores.
Okay.
Had they not done that, could have been a different story. But again, I think at some point, the whole mystique and the whole thing were passé. So I believe, they did the right thing. Although it felt like when they did it, it was like, for the two people out there who still care, here's Kiss without makeup, especially with two new guys. So it took a little bit of time for people to take them seriously again without makeup, But it was a necessary move.
Okay. So you guys both agree. Pask, what's your opinion on this one?
This is a difficult question because it's so multifaceted. Number one, would they have survived the 80s with makeup if Peter and Ace were still in the band? I would say no. Without Peter and Ace, definitely no. I don't think there's anything they could have done for them to survive the 80s with makeup. Patrick even said it. What if they didn't change their music? What if their music could remain consistent? I still think they wouldn't have made it, because people at the time weren't listening with their ears. They were listening with their eyes. And Kiss put themselves in that trap. And they were so big visually. I mean, they reached heights that no other band ever did. And where are you going to go from there? It's down. It's down. And Michael said it as well. Creatures was an amazing album, and it just didn't do very well because people were fed up with the band. The visuals for them were gone, passe. They were listening with their eyes, and their eyes were saying, I don't want to see this anymore. So the makeup needed to come off, and that was the only way they would survive. And the music in Lick It Up wasn't as good as Creatures. But because people now close their eyes and listen, I think they appreciated the music that much more. Because to them, this is a new band now. Let's see what they're about. Let's see what direction they're going. And I think that really, really helped them. That was a genius move on their part, because they wouldn't be here today if that makeup didn't come off.
Good point. Yeah, well, there's not much to say on my end. You guys, basically, you covered it all. Just a little thing that I wanted to add is that, the changes in the lineup also helped, I think, for them not to continue with the makeup, because we all know now that both Paul and Gene, they were not very happy with the new characters. They kind of adopted the Fox for Eric Carr, but the fact that they had to create a new one for Vinny, and Vinny was gone, so that created a new problem for them, in terms of keeping up with the makeup. So I know that Vinny, it's still with Lick It Up and all the stuff, but things were not going great with him. So he had a short life, lifespan with the band. So I think that getting rid of the makeup, that gave them more freedom to basically have a wider choice of guitar players, when they started to consider kicking out Vinny. So but yeah, as you guys just said, it was a much needed move for them to basically to try to reconquer the American market, because they were doing great. We talked about this. They were doing great in Europe. They had a huge success in Australia. They toured South America for the first time, but they wanted to succeed, or they wanted to continue or to survive in the American market. So definitely a much needed change. Yeah.
So, obviously Kiss did survive in the 80s and well beyond 50 years. But how did they compare to other icons of that era? So here's a doozy of a first question. How successful was Kiss in adapting to the MTV era versus other bands that essentially were built for it? So was their visual presence on par with their contemporaries in the 80s? Pat, what do you think?
It's a tough question, because I think the problem when they dropped the makeup, they were trying to figure out, there was no doubt that they were a good band. They were able to prove that, but it's like, visually, what are we going to do being such a visual band? Could they get away with just playing on stage, nothing? That's not they sold themselves as at first. But at the same time, they had to, kind of like win back the fans that went away. And I believe they were looking at their contemporaries and going, "Oh, let's try this. Let's try this." So it was a very, very difficult time for them, until I would say maybe Hot in the Shade, because you can tell they were going for different sounds that were very similar. They were trying to be current, which is a tough thing for them. So how did they compare? I hate to say it, but they had a hard time. Not for lack of trying, but maybe lack of direction of going, who are we, or figuring out who they were.
Okay. Michael, what do you think?
So based on Patrick's answer, it seems like I'm gonna disagree with him. I think that Kiss going into the 80s had plenty of ammunition in terms of dealing with the MTV era. I mean, by 1981, August of 81, I think, when MTV first aired, Kiss had already made music videos for I Was Made for Loving You and Sure Know Something, World Without Heroes, Shandy, and then obviously, I guess their first official video of the MTV era was I Love It Loud. They had already had all this, if you want to call it preparatory work before the MTV era, you could call it that, kind of like, I mean, I don't think in 1979 you could have guessed that we were going to have an MTV and then a Much Music, et cetera, but sure enough, there it was. And much like Queen, did some music videos in the 70s that prepared them for the more visual aspects of the 1980s. You could say the same thing, for Kiss. So once MTV came on board and embraced hard rock and metal and eventually glam metal, I mean, the 80s were the decade when this kind of music really ruled, and the only decade where it did on a not just on a commercial level, but also in a society knows all about this as well. They're talking about it. It's on Entertainment Tonight. It's on all these kinds of shows and stuff. So it's getting more visibility. So I think Kiss was very prepared for this, and I also think that Kiss had an influence on bands going forward into the 80s that came around that we're going to talk about. A band like Mötley Crüe. I mean, I was I was looking online when I was preparing for this interview, because in the back of my mind I was like, I think those two videos are kind of alike. If you watch the video for All Hell's Breaking Loose from Lick It Up, which came out in early 1984, and then if you watch the Too Young to Fall in Love video from Mötley Crüe, you see a lot of similarity there. But which one came first? It was All Hell's Breaking Loose that came first. So I don't know if that's ever been discussed with anybody in Mötley Crüe to say, hey, were you influenced by that? But there is I did see a similarity there. As I was watching them, a similarity that went right over my head in 1984 or 1983. But there it was. So was Kiss prepared to deal with MTV or to be on MTV? I think they definitely were. And then going forward with albums like Animalize and Asylum and Crazy Nights, I mean, whether you like the videos or not, whether you like the songs or not, they were some very eye-catching videos, that got people's attention, and then obviously going into Hot in the Shade. So we're kind of coming out of the 80s with Hot in the Shade. They were still having an impact, So I would have to say that Kiss, in terms of dealing with the 1980s MTV era, I think they were very successful.
Okay. Claudio?
Yeah, I'm with Michael on this one. It all depends how you define success. If you compare to the 70s, of course, they are not, par to par with the original lineup and all the huge success in the 77, 78. But I think that if there's something that Kiss has, it's this kind of ability and capability to adapt to different things. We've always talked about this, how many different genres of music they played, how many different looks they had. They are troopers, man. They fought the fight, they were trying to stay active and relevant. And yeah, so now that Mike mentions that, videos like Heaven's on Fire, and even when they released, Kiss Exposed and all of that, not bad at all, for a band like Kiss. That they came from a complete different world, with makeup, with the costumes and all of that. We can agree that maybe the one that didn't fit so well into this new scheme was Gene, but I think that Paul, did what he had to do to keep the band, floating and alive. a good looking, kind of sexy guy, trying to attract, the female audience and all of that. So I think they were prepared. So whether if it's a huge success, maybe not, but they were well prepared to adapt.
I don't know who I'm disagreeing with or agreeing with here, because I'm going to argue that they weren't prepared for this, because they weren't consciously preparing for something that's upcoming. The videos we saw in the 70s were basically concert videos. This is what Kiss is like in concert. Wow, cool, but it wasn't a video per se. Now, what I don't understand about the 80s is that when Kiss went into the 80s, I love All Hell's Breaking Loose and Love Gun because they had a theme of an apocalyptic world. Kiss was more of in the background. The videos told a story. That was really cool. That was really different. That was not something that we saw very much in the 80s from the band at the time. That was Kiss. But like Patrick said, in the 80s, Kiss is still trying to define who they were. And that started to come out after Lick It Up, because then it was the glammy costumes and the jumping through fire hoops and all this nonsense. I mean, what the heck, They were, in my opinion, in the right direction. They could have been trendsetters in the 80s with their videos. And then they tried to be like everybody else in the 80s with Asylum and Animalize, and especially with Crazy Nights. So I don't know if I agree or don't agree, but no, they weren't prepared for it. I don't think they knew what they were doing. I think they were lucky with the videos for Lick It Up. Those were really cool. And if they knew what they were, where they were going, they would have continued that theme and created something really special. But then along the way, they got lost, and we saw those darn costumes. Yeah, that to be in the band at the time, that must have been difficult in terms of making decisions and where are we going next? What are we going to do next? But they were definitely not built for 80s MTV, in my opinion. Okay,
good. So you wrapped it up, after going through kind of a political speech, which is great. You wrapped it up. That's good.
In other words, saying nothing.
Well, it sounded so good, man. It was good. So, guys, how did Kiss musical direction in the 80s compare to other hard rock and glam metal acts like Mötley Crüe, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, Rat, you name it, so many. So now let's talk about music. Pask, on to you.
Oh boy. Okay, listen, those bands in the 80s, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, they were huge. The biggest bands in the world at the time. And there's a reason why. That their music was very 80s, very catchy, very simple, very mainstream. That's not what Kiss was, or Kiss ever was, or Kiss is at the time. Mm-hmm. So they tried to be a Def Leppard and a Bon Jovi, especially with Crazy Nights, and we know what happened there. They, again, every time Kiss tries to be anything other than Kiss, in my opinion, they fail. Don't be like Bon Jovi, you're not Bon Jovi. Don't be like Def Leppard, you're not Def Leppard. Be Kiss. And I'm going to reiterate, what they were doing in Lick It Up was an amazing direction. If they continued that direction, it would have been amazing Kiss in the 80s. But then they tried to be these other bands that you can't compare. And if you compare song to song from Kiss and these other bands, I love Kiss music. I love that. I love a lot of the lyrics. I love the theme behind their music, the message behind their music. But let's be honest, their music at best is average, at best. And a lot of the stuff that Def Leppard came up with and Bon Jovi, Kiss cannot compare to those guys. Even some of the songs from Mötley Crüe, Kiss can't compare. Mötley Crüe took what Kiss did musically to a higher level in terms of these party songs. And Kiss went as far as they can go with that, because that's what they are musically. Because Kiss, what they do is they have their music, and what makes their music powerful is the background visuals. Take It Alone, it doesn't have that power. Now, take those songs and put the visuals in the background. Does it compare to a Def Leppard or Bon Jovi? I would say yes, because we're listening with our eyes and ears. But if we're just listening with our ears, I don't think Kiss music in the 80s compared to their contemporaries.
Okay.
I'm going to be shot, huh?
No, but no, it's an interesting one. But yeah, it's you have a point. It's good. So, Pat, what do you think?
Well, it's funny you talk about that. Question is great only because last week I purchased Animalize on CD, the remastered, because now it's my turn to get shot when Kiss reunited. Anything between Lick It Up and Revenge, I got rid of, CD wise and album wise, because I thought it was bad. Now I'm getting reacquainted with that, and the CD was $7.99 brand new. So I thought, well, what do I got to lose? So I put it on and I go, well, there's some good stuff on there, but the fact that Gene was only part-time there is part, not the whole thing, but part of the reason why 80s Kiss had a hard time.
Yeah.
Paul had some good songs on that. I've Had Enough, which is a good opener. I've always hated Heaven's on Fire, but that's just me. But Get All You Can Take, Under the Gun is the best song on that record. As well as Thrills in the Night. Those are just brilliant. So I'm happy that I purchased it. I'm going to do the same thing with Asylum. Crazy Nights, I'm not sure, but Hot in the Shade for sure. So with with that, I can say I think again it goes back to what I was saying, a lack of direction, especially from Gene. And I think Paul was right being upset, saying I'm the only one basically driving this ship, and I don't get any support. But having said that, I think you take the best songs off Asylum and Animalize, it could have been a more solid record. You could have gotten one solid record that could have aged better. So again, it was a problem of finding, they said it themselves, that they were trying to find who they were. Quick story, if you pull out your history book, and to me the most interesting part is not the first 7 years, because we know so much about it. There wasn't much new there, but during those harder times, you understand why, because they no longer had Bill O'Coin, Neil Bogart, Ace and Peter, basically everyone from their system. They were on their own, and for them that was a bit scary. And I think they didn't say it at the time, but they probably felt insecure and things like that. Yeah. Things show in the music and in the way the band is. That's my take on that. So the music didn't compare, because like Pask said, Def Leppard and Bon Jovi, it was their time. It was their time. Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of Def Leppard, but I understand what you mean, Pask, by saying that there was quality and it appealed to a greater mass. Kiss has always been that black sheep band, so they could have been more Bon Jovi and Def Leppard than those bands. It still wouldn't have mattered because of who they are. This is not what you expect from Kiss.
But you also have to think that the band was going through many changes. So when we say Kiss, what's the point of reference? If it's the original lineup, anything is going to be different. So, yeah.
Well, I meant more in a musical sense. I mean,
yeah.
They would have done a hard rock album with Dynasty and Unmasked, whether Peter was there or not. They would have said, well, there was a change, but at least Kiss didn't change. That was the first big misstep going into that direction.
Okay, being followers. Okay. Michael.
So the question here is, how did Kiss's musical direction in the 80s compare? So I think overall what I think here is that I think they fared fairly well. Not really well, excellently well, but not poorly either. I think they fared okay. But when you compare them to acts that were starting up and coming along, like the three that we mentioned, or the four that we mentioned, Mötley Crüe, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, let's just take those three. If you take the core albums of those bands in the same time period, from let's say the the beginning of the 80s, or like 82, 83, all up to the end of the 80s, I don't think there's any comparison whatsoever. Bon Jovi went from great debut album to great second album was 7800 Fahrenheit to absolutely incredible and astonishingly fantastic third album, to also really great and phenomenal fourth album with New Jersey, and Slippery When Wet was the third album.
Yeah.
So, you're going from strength to strength to strength to strength. And that happens with a lot of bands when they're starting out. You have youthful energy, you have an abundance of great material. You're not affected yet too much by the music industry, by distractions, whatever those distractions may be. So you're putting all your energy into making great music. If you take someone like Def Leppard, I'm no more a really big Def Leppard fan, but back in the 80s I was. And starting from the early 80s with On Through the Night and High and Dry and Pyromania, I mean, those were excellent hard rock records. And then when you got to Hysteria and they worked with a certain genius named Robert John Mutt Lang, I mean, that was a winning formula. I played Hysteria to death in 1987 or 88, 87 when it came out. I mean,
pretty good album.
Yeah, very good album. It sounds dated now, in my opinion, but it's hard to knock the song quality. And even a band like Mötley Crüe, who I still like very much, but they in my opinion had a misstep or a low moment with Girls, Girls, Girls. But all their other 80s albums are winners.
Yeah.
All of them. Too Fast for Love, Shout at the Devil, Theater of Pain, which is criminally underrated in my opinion. Skip over Girls, 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 and you get to Dr. Feelgood, which was a comeback album of sorts. So, but you compare, if you take those three bands and those three catalogs or portions of catalogs that I just talked about, and you compare that to what Kiss put out, starting with, let's say, Lick It Up, Animalize, Asylum, Crazy Nights, and if you want to include Hot in the Shade in that as well, fine. I think, like I said off the top, I think I think Kiss did well. They fared well in terms of musical direction and trying to put out the best product possible. But did these other bands put out better product? Absolutely. There's no question in my mind.
Good stuff. Well, yeah, I'm gonna keep it short. I'm with you guys. I don't think it can be compared, and that kind of music, I don't think it's in Kiss's DNA. We were talking about, basically it was Paul trying to run the show, with a little bit of support from Eric, a newly entered, guitar player with Bruce Kulick, and Gene completely absent, from the scene and composition and the writing stuff. So it was tough. It was tough. It was basically a band looking for direction, but you cannot compare to, we talked about Bon Jovi and Mötley and Def Leppard. They were in their prime, the energy. They were young, creativity, and something that is really important. Kiss has always been really, really cautious on money. If they had put more money on good producers, maybe the story could have been different. So we talked about Dr. Feelgood, they had Bob Rock, they had huge producers. So why not, when Bon Jovi started writing, they got Desmond Child, as part of the writing process, and look, the hits that they wrote. While in the case of Kiss, Kiss was basically self-producing those albums. It was Gene and Paul, trying to save some bucks. I don't know why, but that's what you got. There wasn't. I don't think there was too much time put in an effort, in the composition of those songs. They were just trying to keep, to keep afloat, to keep alive, and that's about it. Don't get me wrong. So Kiss fans will be pissed at us, but they are good. They are good albums for Kiss fans. That's what it is. But they're not great for any other, rock lover or hard rock or glam rock. You're not going to put Lonely is the Hunter, or some of those songs, to be back to back with some of the stuff from Def Leppard or Mötley Crüe. But look, at that time, Kiss had been on the road for almost 12, 15 years. Those other bands were new, so it's a completely different thing.
Like I said in a previous episode, I believe, I can listen to Asylum from beginning to end and enjoy it and think it's okay, but I can also think of many other things I can do with that 40 or 45 minutes that are much better, or other albums that I can listen to. It's just the reality. Now, would I say that about Creatures of the Night? No, absolutely not. I'd be like, no, put that on, and that's the best thing I can do for the next 40 minutes, So.
But Claudia, good point that you made there when you said, "Oh, Kiss fans are going to kill you." No, they won't. Why would they? Listen, let's be serious here. Kiss isn't the best. There are bands better than them musically. There are. They exist. They do. But they're the best to us.
Yeah.
And that's what matters.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked music now. How about live performance? So in terms of live performance and touring, how did Kiss measure up to the stage shows of contemporaries like Iron Maiden, Ozzy Osbourne? Claudio, back to you.
I think it can also apply to live performance. They tried, with a huge logo for Asylum and those beautiful costumes that they put on. They tried to do something different with Animalize, but it's really hard for me to think about Kiss and not think about the bombastic and the fire, the explosions and all of that, So I know that it comes hand in hand with the makeup, of course. So when you take off the makeup, maybe it's not going to work, spitting blood or breathing fire. But long story short, to me, you cannot compare to live shows like Ozzy or Iron Maiden at that time. Same thing. They try to stay relevant, but without a clear direction. So if you think that they put up, all the Animalized kind of gear, and 1 year later they were doing Asylum. It's a complete different band, no personality. It was like a complete change, trying to be followers, trying to look like, beautiful girls, but it doesn't work with Kiss.
Okay, Michael?
Okay, in terms of live performance, look, my answer here kind of is going to go in the same vein as the previous question. Or my answer is going to be in the same vein as the previous question. I think they fared well or okay overall. I think they, did okay. But again, you have stronger competitors here. Okay. I mean, if you look at Ozzy coming off of, his time with Black Sabbath, I mean, in the 80s, him too went from strong album to strong album to strong album, and the tours were very well attended, very revered, even to this day. Those 80s tours, I mean, you could look at Ultimate Sin and say, okay, maybe that was a bit of a weak album, but even then, it's better. Ultimate Sin is still better than Asylum and Animalize put together, as far as I'm concerned. And the tour was also very successful, and included openers like Queensryche and a young and up and coming Metallica. Now, if you're talking about Iron Maiden, I'm sorry, they're at the top of the pyramid. You cannot say anything to convince me otherwise. I mean, there's enough. Even if you didn't see any Maiden shows live, in the 80s, I was lucky enough to see the Somewhere in Time tour and the Seventh Son of a Seventh Son tour. So Power Slave I missed, and Peace of Mind, a Number of the Beast before, I missed. But there's enough video footage around that you can see those shows as well. And again, you can't compare. These guys were doing things and putting on shows and bringing and winning fans over, and having fans come back year after year, tour after tour, following them around from show to show on the same tour. I mean, that's Grateful Dead level stuff, if you can get that kind of, commitment out of your fans. And another band I'll bring up, a band sort of in the same, not in the same vein as Judas Priest, but as Kiss. I gave away the answer, but Judas Priest started out around the same time in terms of putting out albums as Kiss. So Judas Priest were kind of in the same boat as Kiss were in the 80s. But look what Judas Priest did. They put out Screaming for Vengeance. They put out Defenders of the Faith. They took a bit of a left turn with the Turbo album musically, but they were still drawing arenas full of fans. And you look
same thing applies with Van Halen. Van Halen too. We forget about those guys.
It was like up. I mean, it's whether you look back now and you can say, okay, well, I prefer that album and that tour and that tour. There's no denying that if you walked into the let's say the Montreal Forum here locally back in 1984. Okay, how many people are at this Van Halen show? Oh, every seat is taken. 2 years later, new lead singer with Sammy Hagar. You walk into the show in 1986. Well, every seat is taken. That says something. You can't really say the same thing with Kiss. I mean, those tours in from 83 to 88, 87, let's say. I mean, attendance spotty at best. Sometimes good, sometimes not good. Some markets were good, some markets were not good. But to their credit, they went out every night and put on good shows to the best of their ability. So, it comes back to what I said in the beginning, which is they fared well overall, but compare them to an Iron Maiden, compare them to an Ozzy Osbourne, compare them to a Van Halen or a Judas Priest that I mentioned, that there is no comparison. And especially in the case of a Judas Priest who had been around as long as Kiss had been around at that time, because both bands put out their first albums in 74. And if you were to do the same test, go to a Kiss concert 1 week and go to a Judas Priest concert the next week. Yeah, you're gonna see. You would definitely see a difference.
See the difference.
Yeah, for sure. So, short answer: overall, they fared well. They kept pace, but they were not the winners.
Okay, good. Patrick?
I think musically they had improved with having two guys, and you can tell when they played they were pumped, and also being free of the costumes and the makeup and everything. They ran more. They put more energy. With a pretty stripped down show. Now, it's ironic, one of the most visual bands in the 80s is they basically had nothing, although I did like the Animalized stage show, the American one, simple, but it reminded me of Dynasty in a way. Simple, but you knew you were going to get something good out of it. And I liked the idea of them coming down at the end of Black Diamond, I believe.
Yeah.
That was a good visual element. Now, like Michael was saying, you have bands like Iron Maiden, Dio even at that time putting on visual shows. Could Kiss compete with them? They looked, I hate to say it, but it looked very poor. Because like you had these bands that put on such great shows, and even another band that is not metal, but Pink Floyd, when they made their comeback in 87, it's like, wow, these guys. I've never been a huge Pink Floyd fan, but I know someone who went to the show and he said, you think Kiss is cool? Well, this is nothing compared to the Pink Floyd show. Having said that, probably it gave a chance also to say that Kiss could still pull it off musically, but I don't think they regained the confidence of people until 88 on that European tour when they played the Monsters of Rock tour. And I think that's kind of what showed that Kiss, even though they're not visual, they can still be good. Look at another example when they opened for Whitesnake, and that was in 1990 in Toronto. There was this debate between Paul Stanley and David Coverdale about Kiss not using any visuals.
Yeah.
That gave them the incentive to say, okay, we're still going to put on a great show. But the stage shows by themselves, like the Crazy Nights tour with, the Crazy Nights tour and the Asylum tours with a huge logo. Funny enough, I was never a big fan of that logo. I preferred the previous one that they had used for 6-7 years. but no stage show. There was nothing. It was kind of empty. So again, you compared that with what was going on at the time. It looked kind of cheap, I hate to say.
Well, listen, a lot of our listeners know that I checked out in the 80s, but when I saw Kiss in 79, the Dynasty Tour, that show made such an impression on me that every time I saw a concert, I compared it to that show. Now, in the 80s, I had a friend who was working security at the Montreal Forum. And he gave me and my friend a lot of free tickets. So I saw a lot of shows in the 80s, including Van Halen 1984. Just an amazing
nice.
show. Now, and I remember seeing all these shows and saying the visuals, it doesn't compare to what I saw in Dynasty. Not even close. But then asking myself, but then why did I enjoy this show that much? Almost as much as I did with Dynasty, because the music was so powerful. What Van Halen did in 1984 was just incredible. So watching a Kiss show, and when your adrenaline goes up and you scream and shout when you hear a firebomb or see an amazing visual effect, is the same effect it has on the person when that song comes out from Van Halen or Ozzy Osbourne or Iron Maiden. It's not the visual. It's when they play that first chord of that song, you go, oh my God, yes! Just like we saw that firebomb thing, you know? So I think Kiss cannot compare to any other band on tour because their music wasn't at par with those bands in the 80s.
Good point.
God, I'm going to get killed on this show.
No, that's a really good point, because I remember that, in the 80s, Kiss was trying to reinvent themselves, and they were not playing a lot of 70s stuff.
Yeah.
So basically they were playing material from albums that, as we're going to discuss in the next question, and we've discussed so far, it wasn't great. So if you don't have great songs, which are a huge part of a live performance, then how are you going to get people pumped up? It's
Exactly.
tough.
Exactly.
So let's move into the songwriting perspective now. So again, how does Kiss compare 80s Kiss? How does it compare? Let's say let's take as an example, Lick It Up, Asylum, Crazy Nights. So how do those albums hold up next to albums like Shout at the Devil or Hysteria, or you mentioned before, Michael, so Slippery When Wet or New Jersey, some others. But start with you this time.
I think Lick It Up is one of their best albums. I think it's the best non-makeup album, even better than Revenge. I love Revenge, but Lick It Up is my favorite. And I believe they could have kept that pace if, let's say, Vinny would have stayed in the band. I believe they could have reestablished themselves with something that was very, very solid musically. And I think Lick It Up itself, it's as good as Shout at the Devil, in my opinion. And I'm a big fan of Shout at the Devil, by the way. But the minute Animalize came out, I knew we were in trouble, unfortunately. Because again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the lack of involvement from Gene. Although I can say that Asylum is a little better than Animalize, in my opinion. A little better, not that much, but there's some potential there. But again, the lack of involvement from Gene really shows. So, they put that out while you have albums like you mentioned, Hysteria coming out, or even White Snake, Snake, Poison, and all those people. So it's like, where does Kiss fit into that? Once again, that's always a question. Where do they fit into that? So, and unfortunately, the material, although they were doing their best, regardless of the situation, they didn't still hit it. Under Hot in the Shade, I understood what they were trying to do. Hot in the Shade, you could tell that they were tried to redo Rock and Roll Over. I was like, okay, they're trying something here.
Yeah, it's a comeback. Yeah,
but between that They had a hard time, unfortunately. Again, I hate to say it, but I have to be realistic. In the 80s, Kiss really had a hard time, and I kind of understood when people told me, "Oh, Kiss, they're not that good," because they would pay attention to the 80s albums. They wouldn't pay attention to the vintage ones. So I believe that might have been part of the problem. So it didn't hold up very well compared to other records, unfortunately.
Okay. Pasc?
Put my log in your fireplace. Enough said. Enough said. Enough said. We're talking about songwriting perspective. That's it. Enough said.
That's
Listen.
poetry.
Really, you know. Listen, Gene has always been the face of Kiss. Paul has been the voice. But what do people remember is Gene. And even in the 80s, people remember Gene's material. And I'm sorry, garbage like that, because he wasn't in the band. And it hurts people's perspective of the band in the 80s. Gene didn't do Kiss any good service in the 80s by not being there fully. It would have been amazing if the Revenge Gene was there throughout the 80s. It might have been something completely different. Yeah. Now, I agree with Pat. Lick It Up is one of the best of the 80s. Absolutely. Although I think Revenge is better, in my opinion. But that is just an amazing start. An amazing start. But I remember in the 80s when I was rediscovering Kiss and listening to their 70s stuff, and Pat, you're going to disagree with me, but at the time, I remember it's like, oh my God, this is so good. This is much better than the vintage stuff. I enjoyed the 80s stuff more than the vintage. But in the 80s, I was listening to so many other bands because I had checked out. And when I started comparing 80s Kiss to other bands, in my mind, they didn't compare. They were good Kiss songs for Kiss, but do not compare them to other bands in the 80s because you just cannot.
Okay. Michael, your turn.
Okay, I think this is the question I did the most amount of homework on. So from a songwriting perspective, I think this is pretty clear cut. From a songwriting material point of view, from a perspective point of view, that doesn't make sense. From a songwriting material point of view, Paul's material for me holds up. Most of it holds up through the 80s. He's definitely the one putting in the effort and the quality. I think that's a very important word. Gene's material after Lick It Up, not so much. Let's be clear, and let's be honest. And I think we all agree on that. Here's some interesting things I found out in preparing for this question. Shout at the Devil and Lick It Up were both released in September of 1983. Both of those albums came out at the same time. Imagine being someone in 1983 and buying those two albums. Which one do you think you're going to, prefer? I mean, for me, Lick It Up is a good album, but Shout at the Devil is quintessential Mötley Crüe. So again, from a songwriting perspective, Nikki Sixx in his prime, that's the magnum opus right there. Perhaps you can make an argument for Dr. Feelgood as well. But I remember when Shout at the Devil came out and how many people I knew were getting into that album and that band because of that album. Def Leppard, Hysteria, was released in August of 1987. Crazy Nights was released the following month. Now imagine being Kiss releasing Crazy Nights 1 month after Hysteria comes out. How can you compete with that from a songwriting point of view? It's like you have an album of 12 incredible songs on Hysteria. Even the weak songs are incredible, for Christ's sakes, And then you have, Crazy Nights comes out a month later. I don't know how there could have been competition there from a listening point of view. To if we're talking about songwriting and song quality here. Same thing with Bon Jovi. Slippery When Wet came out in August of 86. So kind of in between Asylum and Crazy Nights. So in this space vacated by Kiss, not vacated, but at a time when Kiss was out touring Asylum for the most part, Bon Jovi puts out this incredible album, their third album. And, they had, as you pointed out, Claudio, they had Desmond Child helping them out for the first time. And they were coming up with excellent material. And winning people over. One of Patrick's favorite bands, Poison. Look What the Cat Dragged In came out in May of 1986. So right at the end of the Asylum tour. So Kiss finishes touring Asylum. They go away, and who shows up? It's like their cousins show up, with even a little more makeup and just as outrageous costumes. And they put out Look What the Cat Dragged In. I don't know if I would call it Poison's magnum opus. I don't know if you can use that term with Poison, but still a fantastic album and a great launching pad. Meanwhile, Kiss went away for about a year, then put out Crazy Nights, and well, we all know what happened with Crazy Nights. It wasn't only until, and this has been pointed out already in this episode, it wasn't only until Kiss went to Europe and toured with the Monsters of Rock and then did their own shows in the UK and Europe that they started. I don't know how they realized it or who decided it. It was most likely Paul, let's be honest, to put back some of these older songs and, road test some of these songs again. And then, when the Hot in the Shade tour came along, boom, it's like, okay, here's the set list we've been waiting for the past 7 years. So again, from a songwriting perspective, Kiss did their best. And when I mean Kiss, I mean Paul did his best. And Gene contributed what he did, and the log is in the fireplace.
just to wrap it up. Well, you guys, I'm with you guys, so you can't compare. And it's and I go back to maybe the contributions that were working or not working with Kiss at that time. So we mentioned how great Lick It Up is, and we had Vinnie Vincent there, we had Michael James Jackson on production, and then the next great album from Kiss is when Bob Ezrin came back, and we had a beautiful lineup with Eric Singer and Bruce Kulick with Revenge, and what happened in between those two great albums, to me was survival. They were trying their best, don't get me wrong, but it's really tough, with Gene not being there and not a lot of vision to basically select good producers and dedicate time to writing. So when we're talking about writing, which is basically this question, we all agree that songwriting was fantastic in Lick It Up and then in Revenge. But in the middle, you're right, Michael. Maybe a couple of tunes from Paul, but if you put them, back to back with "Shout at the Devil" or "Hysteria" or some of the other stuff from Van Halen, and Pat, you mentioned 1987 from Whitesnake. Oh my God, it's you can't compare.
They reinvented themselves, or someone helped reinvent them for an American market, so they got glammed up. And
absolutely,
here's a self-titled, what seems almost to be a self-titled debut album by this band.
Yeah,
it wasn't. It was like their 6th or 7th album, but for an American audience, it's a great jumping off point. And then you can go back and listen to their previous albums, and if you like what you hear, well, then you're a fan. But yeah, exactly. Just that album alone puts a lot of what Kiss did in the 80s to shame.
Well, it's true. I like what you did. Comparing the timeline. It was hard competition for Kiss, man. It was really, really tough to be on top of the game, against those bands, in their prime. There was their prime time.
And the music industry, this comes back to something I said in the first question, where, MTV, MTV was on board with all these kinds of bands. And as a result, the music industry was more on board with all these bands. So it's no surprise that you had an influx of these kinds of bands. At a certain point, you got saturated, but it's not a surprise that you have a lot of bands that fall under the hair metal or glam metal moniker that came out in this period of time, because, it's like I mean, it's like, if you plant a seed, if you water it every day, well, you're going to get a tree. Well, that's what it was. You got a glam metal tree in the 80s that was fully sprouted and was, bared fruit and gave good shade at the same time. So yeah.
I don't want our listeners to think that we're putting down 80s Kiss, because we're not. We love 80s Kiss, right? I often tell my students, don't compare yourself with other people. Don't necessarily compete with other people, but compete with yourself. And this is no different. 80s Kiss was amazing. I loved 80s Kiss music. But now if we're going to start comparing it to their contemporaries in the 80s, well, okay, we have to be honest here. And I think this is where this final question comes in. And it's an interesting one, because looking back, does 80s Kiss deserve more credit for their output during that decade, or are they rightly overshadowed by the newer, flashier acts of the time? Back to you, Michael.
Okay, so I'm going to answer this two ways. I'm going to first of all, let me answer this strictly looking at the 1980s, okay? So do they deserve credit for their output? I'm going to say that in the 1980s specifically, if I use an analogy, they were in the race, but they were not the winners. They definitely stayed competitive. They were there, but did they finish first? Did they even get a medal? No, I don't think so. They definitely did their best in the 80s to stay as relevant as possible, to make as good music as they could under the circumstances, and put on the tours that they did. I mean, you can't fault their work ethic, that's for sure. Album tour. I mean, it's, it was, what they did in the 70s, they repeated in the 80s, because they, I'm sure they felt, okay, well, we're kind of, our backs are against the wall a little bit here, we're kind of starting new, so let's put in the effort, kind of thing. And well, we all know some people put in more effort than others, but for me, 80s Kiss is highlighted mainly by their touring and the amount of shows that they did and the quality of the shows that they did. The music is something else. So with respect to the 80s, they were in the race, but they didn't win. However, here's an interesting point I'd like to make. If you compare Kiss overall with these other bands in the long run, in other words, for the longevity of their careers, and all of these bands we've talked about are still around. None of these bands have gone away. Mötley Crüe is still around. Poison is still around. Def Leppard is still around. Van Halen, no, that's probably an exception. Iron Maiden's still around. Judas Priest still around. If you look at it from this point of view, has Kiss fared better? Do they deserve more credit? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. If you compare Kiss overall to Mötley Crüe overall, for me, Kiss is the winner. If you compare them to Poison, Kiss is the winner. Same thing with Ozzy Osbourne. I love Ozzy. I love Black Sabbath. But I think overall Kiss has had a better career overall than Ozzy. Now, in some cases, I think they're about equal. Iron Maiden, I think they're equal.
Okay.
Bon Jovi, same thing, equal. Def Leppard, equal, in my opinion. So they haven't, when you look at Kiss overall, 50 years or 45 years or however long you want to look at it, compared to all these other bands that have also been around for about the same length of time, or maybe a little less, but still for a number of decades, they haven't lost against, in my opinion, against any of these bands. They're either equals or betters.
That's a very interesting approach, and a nice way to look at it, because if we take into account, let's say 83 to 88, we're talking about only 5 years out of 50 years of career, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's true.
But we've been focusing on the 80s and their output in the 80s and their performances in the 80s and their songwriting in the 80s, and that's all well and good and everything, and I think overall we've kind of reached a consensus for the most part that their competitors were doing a little better than them. But if you look at the big picture, I think I think there's gold medal. There are a few gold medals there.
And that's why they're legends. Patrick, what do you think?
I think they deserve more credit, and I'll tell you why. Because let's face it, they were hard times for Kiss, and they could have easily, Paul and Gene at least say, hey, you know what, let's go our separate ways and let's make solo careers. This isn't working, or not as good as expected. That might be a better way to put it. So they could have easily just said we gave up and let's do something else and then regroup like Deep Purple did, or some other people.
Mhm.
They said no, we're going to stay in the race, and they pretty much had the mentality that we're the bad dream that won't go away. I think Gene said something like that, which I kind of like. So it's like, no, it's not up to the critics or to the fans even to say when we're done. We'll decide when we're done. So they they made sure that they stayed there and they did their best, and for that I think they deserve credit. They persevered where some people might have given up way before, because they were hard times for sure. A good way to maybe find out what was going on in their minds when we read Kiss and Sell again, that book. My favorite part is during the 1984 till they were that management went their separate ways from Kiss.
Mhm.
But it gives a good perspective on what they were trying to do and what they were. So never did they say, "Oh, we give up." They said, "Okay, let's try this." At least they get the. We have to mention their effort to being current and say we're still relevant. So
Yeah.
for that, they deserve more credit for sure. And it's like wine, is some of the stuff you listen to it and you give it another look and you go, you know what, it's not that bad. Like with Animalize, like I said, I found a few good songs there. So with a different perspective, you give it a second chance and you think, well, there's some good stuff there for sure. As we said, compared to what was going on, maybe not, but better than what our memory thinks.
Okay, Claudio.
Yeah, I think they do. I think they do deserve, more credit. I love what Pat and Michael just said. Put things into perspective in terms of the timeline, and also the fact that they kept releasing material. Maybe not that good as the 70s or what came after with Revenge, but they never gave up and they kept touring. So they could have gone dormant for 4 or 5 years, thinking what they were going to do, like many bands do. But this is not Kiss. Kiss has their fans used to see them touring all the time, even if it's not the greatest show during that era. But they were releasing records, and now it's always interesting. It's always interesting when you read the paper the day after, right? And this is what we're doing now. But during that time, I remember that I was happy that these guys, they were releasing stuff. Of course, Revenge didn't exist. The reunion tour didn't exist, so you cannot compare. But during that time, it wasn't. I was not so fascinated with the music, that they were releasing, but they were still my favorite band, and I really enjoyed, the fact that they were still around, and just for that, I think that they deserve credit. If you do the analogy of you're running a marathon, right? So you're not going to be running, the 40Ks at the same pace all the time, because you're going to be dead. So sometimes you take a time, your pace goes down, and then you pick up, then you ramp up, and then you finish, strong and stronger and, with more energy. And this is what happened with Revenge. They needed some new, fresh, energy with Eric Singer, with Bruce Kulick. They took some vacation, mainly Gene. They took some vacation during the 80s.
When people tell me, "Oh, Kiss sucks," my answer is always, they've been around for 50 years. I think they did something right.
Yeah.
So when you ask me, do they deserve more credit for their output in the 80s? They absolutely deserve all the credit in the world. Why? Because the 80s didn't kill them. They are who they are today because of the 80s. Part of who they are today is because of the 80s. Did it kill them? No. Do they deserve Credit? Absolutely. Look at The Elder. Did it kill them? No. It deserves credit. Now looking back, fans look at that album back fondly. It didn't kill them. Dynasty? Unmasked? Did it kill them? No. It's part of their history. It's part of who they are today. So like basically we're all saying, especially Michael, you gotta look at the big picture here. They deserve credit for everything they've done. The good, the bad, and the ugly, including the log in the fireplace. It's all part of their history. And it's all part of making them who they are today. And they absolutely deserve credit, because how many bands have made it this far and have achieved this level of success that Kiss have achieved? We can't say that for too many bands.
Yeah. And just let me add something to what you're saying, Pas. So it's maybe it's not a coincidence, but the four of us were kind of, big fans from the 70s, and we know the whole stuff. But we don't have to forget that many Kiss fans, they got into the band because of the 80s.
Yeah.
Maybe not guys on their 60s, or something, but there are a huge fan base that comes, from that era.
It happens with other bands as well. I mean, I've seen, a few polls over the years for like Judas Priest albums. And, their 1990 album Painkiller quite often polls very high as one of their best albums. And there's people who are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
that's
right.
It's like, that's not from the 70s. That's not from the 80s. But it's like,
right.
Yes, but there are a lot of people who got into Judas Priest and heavy metal in general with that album. So it's no wonder that for somebody like that, or for people like that, that album ranks high. Yes, Sad Wings of Destiny is fantastic. Sin After Sin is fantastic. Screaming for Vengeance is fantastic. I can name 5 other ones if you want. But for some people who got into metal and Priest and other bands in the early 90s or late 80s, that's a seminal album for them, because that took them on this journey.
Absolutely.
Not just for Judas Priest music, but for, heavy music in general. It's the same thing with Metallica. It's like, my favorite album is the Black Album. I'm not saying that for myself, but you have people who look at that album as their favorite album. Why? Because that's the album that they got into Metallica with. They didn't get into Metallica with Ride the Lightning and Kill 'Em All 6-7 years ago. They got into them, with something from the 90s, whether it be the Black Album or Load or Reload, whatever you may think of those albums, but that was their gateway album into that band and that kind of music. So it rates highly for them, So it depends. So somebody who got into Kiss in the 80s, they're going to look at Animalize and, it's like, don't talk bad about Animalize. That's the album that got me into Kiss.
Some people didn't even know that Kiss had makeup, in the 70s.
Exactly.
That was the band at that time.
Yeah.
So, gents, thank you again, for having this beautiful discussion. It's fascinating also, all the time to see how much juice we can get from these topics. We could be talking, forever. Pass on to you, Pat. If you want to say something, you're more welcome.
At the time of this recording, June 26th, I'm officially, like I said, on summer vacation. And I couldn't imagine a better way to start my summer vacation than be with you guys talking Kiss on the Kiss Army Nation podcast. And this was a really interesting episode. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're talking more and more about 80s Kiss. And we're seeing that also with other podcasts. More and more people are talking 80s Kiss. It is so underrated. It deserves so much more love, so much more attention. And I think there's plenty more topics to discuss related to this era. And I think we're going to do that.
One last thing, and it's good that we're talking about 80s Kiss. Today, June 26th, on Kiss's official website, kissonline.com, there's an interview with Bruce Kulick that's dropped about Kiss Asylum and his time a little bit before Kiss Asylum, joining the band, etc., and also afterwards. So I haven't read the whole interview yet. I've started reading it during my lunch hour today at work. I'm going to finish it once we're done here. But based on what I've read up till now, I recommend everyone go and read that and get a nice Bruce's perspective on what it was like to get into Kiss, how he felt like being in Kiss at that time, dealing with Gene and Paul, and the making of the music as well. So we're talking about 80s Kiss. Look what dropped today, a brand new interview with Bruce Kulick.
Yeah,
and on the official Kiss website, as well. So I thought that was a nice surprise, quite frankly, to see.
Yeah, it was indeed.
Yeah, so true. Patrick, any final words?
It was great. I love talking about different things, and that was a fun one for sure, because as I just mentioned, it's a mysterious time for the band, and we don't really know much about it because it wasn't that publicized as much as the 70s or the reunion or until today. That's a dark period that is a lot of fun to explore.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Thank you, gents.
Thank you. So to the Kiss Army, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas, please send them to talktome@kissarmynationpodcast.com. Until the next time, remember, never stop rocking. Take care, everyone.